help. So today we're talking about family systems, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Rogers, who is the co-director of our COE. He's also a professor at the UT Graduate School of Medicine. Dr. Rogers has been working with kids and families for many years, trained right here in Knoxville at UT, and is a huge influence on us at the COE and has a lot of knowledge. So we're very happy to have him today. I'll turn the time over.
Thank you, Dr. Dean. I have a lot of knowledge because I'm old, and most of what my knowledge is very useless usually. But no, this is an interesting topic. Anybody get training in family systems when they were in school? Yeah, a lot or a little? A lot. Okay. Would you like to get? I'm glad to hear that because I kind of got the idea that it really wasn't being promoted much these days. But when I was in training, it was a really big idea because it was kind of a new idea. And the basic notion is that when you want to work with kids, you want to work with families because families are where the kids live and they have the most influence on the kid. Caregivers, parents are way more present in the child's life than anyone else, even to some extent school, although that later on gets to be a major influence with that peers. But parents and caregivers see the child in multiple settings, in multiple places. And my opinion is that if you're working with children, you need to work with families. And it doesn't necessarily mean you need to see them all in the same room at the same time every time, although that was kind of a point of view back in the day. But if you are trying to effect a change in a child, you will not have much impact or have maybe a temporary impact if you do not somehow work with the family in order to foster and continue that change. Families and family theory and family therapy kind of arose out of the 50s and 60s, which was when psychological therapies and psychological treatment became very prominent in society and in institutions. A lot of the theories came out of the work with schizophrenic families when they thought that family structure and family influence was what was ideologically important in schizophrenia. That's probably not the case, although certainly families are important with all patients. And this was, if you think about the history of psychotherapy, it started out with Freud and individual work and intensive individual work, largely exploring family structure and family memories and family interactions, but only from the point of view of the patient. And in the 50s, when people were innovating in the 60s, they thought, well, why don't we look at the rest of the family if they're available, not just what the person remembers or tells you about them. Interestingly, the department that I'm in at UT Hospital, family medicine was developed out of the old general practice idea, like the old family doctor, but with a lot of family systems theory built in. So when they wanted to set up a medical specialty and call it family medicine, it was heavily influenced by family therapy and family theory in the late 60s, early 70s. So it's the old idea of the country family doctor coupled with a lot of the ideas from family systems. So that's kind of neat. And a lot of family medicine physicians, especially in the early days of training, were trained extensively in family systems and in family intervention. That's not so much true anymore. But that was the founding of the discipline in which I work. I'm not a family physician, but I teach them. So I'm going to kind of do three basic things today. I'm going to talk about genograms, which is a diagram of family structure. And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about that. And then I'm going to talk about Salvador Minuchin's ideas. He was an influential, he's a psychiatrist, I believe. Was he not? Anybody remember old Minuchin? Recognize the name? Okay. He had a very big influence on family therapy and family systems thinking. He was, for many years, worked out of Philadelphia. When I was in training, we had a lot of Minuchin theory and Minuchin ideas, and I'm going to talk about several of them. He had a structural model talking about the various subsystems within the family systems, and I'm going to talk some about that. And the subtitle of this talk, which is Don't Party with Your Kids, comes right out of Mnuchin's ideas. And then there was a guy named Murray Bowen. Y'all remember him? He was a psychiatrist. He was one of the guys out in Palo Alto and the Bay Area who brought whole families to live in the psychiatric hospitals so they could study them. They were studying schizophrenia, and a lot of the influential work in the 70s and 80s, Jay Haley, Milton Erickson's popularity, all that came out of that group. His ideas are not as neatly encapsulated as Mnuchin's, but a couple of things that he talked about I think are important. One is the nature of triangular or triadic relationships in families, which is the notion that if you have stress between two people in a family or any other two people in a relationship, you can manage that ineffectively by dragging somebody in the middle. And his idea of the task of a child in the family context is to become different. And he saw families that didn't allow this to be problematic. So his famous term was undifferentiated ego mass, which sounds really good. If you say that 3 times, you will sound like you're a wise person. So let's talk about genograms. And then by the time I finish talking about these things, which is not, I don't have a lengthy number of slides, I'm going to diagram a family for you and kind of walk you through how you can use a genogram to understand a family and use some of these other concepts to illustrate that. So it's kind of a case study. Okay? Is that okay? Got questions? Holler at me. I don't mind being interrupted. Okay. So a genogram, that's kind of a basic building block of family understanding. It's a drawing representing a family. The interesting thing right now, anybody on Ancestry.com, you know what that is? That's the thing you can get on there and you can find all your relatives back to the Stone Age. And, they use genograms. You can display it as a kind of a tree which goes sideways, or you can display it as a kind of a genogram going up and down. It's kind of cool, and they will help you access databases. So if you're interested in your family, it's a great resource. It charges you $85 every 3 months until the end of time, but it's a really good idea. Right? So you can see the family as a whole. You can change the genogram as you get more information. It shows the structure, obviously, who's married to who, how many kids they got, whose kids are they. But then there are ways to diagram it that indicate changes in relationships, death, divorce, adoption. And then there are other symbols that can indicate more emotional states, things of that sort. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Anybody use those routinely these days? Okay. They used to be taught all the time in family medicine. They don't do that anymore. It's too bad. But that's another story. And picture's worth 1,000 words. I'm often be sitting with somebody in clinical work, and I think, I got to draw this out because I can't keep track. And people, especially in less differentiated families, they talk about these people as though you know who they are. And, they use inaccurate or, not inaccurate, but undefined, my father. Well, that's really my stepfather, but he's my third stepfather. It's like, I get lost. So here's the kind of the basic ideas. Men are square, women are circles, okay? I've never drawn a genogram with a pen, okay? I think that's weird, all right? And but pets get triangled in often, And when my wife and I, we had a lot of chaos in our family. Our house burned, we had to move, We were sniping each other until we got cats. Okay, so then we could go tell your mother this, This is all true, okay? You can't make this stuff up. So you can, a couple is a horizontal line. A biological child is a solid line. Adopted child is a dashed line. A foster child is a even more thinned out dashed line. And that's probably how it works, right? I've seen people do this. Pregnancies, miscarriages, abortions, stillbirths, those are probably important things to note, all right, because you don't always hear about those things initially, and yet they can have obviously a profound effect on the family. But I don't normally put those in. So you can have, this is getting a little too precise, but separation that's, somebody moved out, this is legal separation. I don't know that that's, is there a legal separation in Tennessee these days? Didn't used to be. I think there is now, yeah, which means that the court has set up some initial rules for them interacting about child support and custody and housing and things of that sort that are in effect before the final divorce decree. A lot of people don't fool with that, right? They move in and out. Here's divorce. Here's a widow. Again, the building block is the couple, and that's called, in Mnuchin's term, the spousal system. Okay? So when you think about a family, the first part of a family in the old way of thinking was a couple. Okay? And that's the first place that the family structure begins to develop. So here's kind of a way to diagram a husband with multiple spouses, okay? So he's divorced from here's a husband, he's divorced from his first wife, but they have 3 children, okay? Twins are indicated like this. Then he married another woman, they had a child. So this child is a half-sister of these. And then they separated, and now he's living with somebody else, okay? This is typical, at least in season, no? Although I don't think they bother with marriage anymore, do they? I've been wanting to sing today. I started singing, that Joni Mitchell song, "We Don't Need No Piece of Paper from the City Hall." You remember that song? No, you don't. Okay. It's probably good that I'm not singing. And then you can kind of talk about the emotional valence of a relationship. That these people are not close. There's some barrier in between. They're estranged or they don't get along. Here's a way to talk about people that don't really give a hoot about one another. Again, the diagramming. I don't know that there's any book that says this is how you got to do it, but these are ways to kind of indicate for your own understanding and your patience, that this is not as tight as this because there's gaps in it, okay? And here's a whole bunch of gaps. And here's a barrier. So it kind of, puts it in graphic terms what you experience when you talk to people. Then you can talk about other kinds of relationships. Here's some that use kind of concrete and easily understand diagrams to talk about conflict and hostility, maybe aggression, okay? So that's the genogram, and you can use it then to begin to look at the structure of the family as Mnuchin talks about it. He talks about the subsystems within a family and how they interact. And they interact, and the family system has a task, which is to continue to function as a unit, to provide for the development of the children. And there are various ways the family does that through the spouse subsystem, number one. And this system is what starts the family. They can or can, that system will decide whether or not they want to become a parental subsystem, or maybe they let nature handle that. But that changes that system once you have children into a parental system, which is tasked with doing kind of the adult stuff in the family, paying the rent, organizing the children's lives for their proper development, interacting with themselves in a different way than they would interact with the children. Okay, and then the sibling subsystem, which doesn't have to be siblings; it can be just one child. But the point is that they do very different things depending on which system you're in. The spouse subsystem continues to be present even after the birth of children. And so the spouses do things that really aren't parental, right? They go on Friday night dates and eat pizza, right? But then when you have the children, what you really need to look at is the relationship of how the parents get along and work together and what the kids do. The parents need to be more of the administrator of the family, okay? And the kids need to be the kids who are trying to develop, and that means that their system is always in flux. And you don't want to, and these things need to be separated out, because what the parents are kind of trying to do is very different from what the kids are trying to do. All right? Kids are not necessarily capable of managing things like paying the rent, making sure there's food in the house, et cetera, et cetera. The parents are supposed to handle that. It's really not supposed to be a concern of the children. Right? The children's concerns have to do with education, learning to get along with people, becoming socialized, developing internal regulation, that sort of thing. And theoretically, the parents already have that down. And theoretically, a lot of problems, as you can see, come when these systems don't operate effectively. So if the parents, for whatever reason, want to abdicate their responsibilities and become more childlike, that's not going to do as well, because who's minding the store? Okay. It's always a temptation, we'll get into this in a minute with Bowen's ideas, because if the two people in the parental system aren't getting along, one of the things they can do is drag a kid into it. Okay? Or the kid can make an effort to go up into interfere in the parental system by saying, well, mom said I could do this, when that's not true. And dad says, well, if your mom says it's okay, well, the kid has kind of interrupted that parental structure by playing them off. That means that the parents aren't communicating if the kid's able to do that, right? And I don't really hold those sorts of things against kids. Kids are one of the tasks of being a child is to learn how to operate in the world. And sometimes that you have to be sneaky to operate in the world, okay? That's a very adaptive thing to be able to do. It doesn't mean that's the only thing you do, but occasionally, those of us who work in large organizations realize that you don't always necessarily ask permission. You might have to ask forgiveness if you need to. So, the kids are kind of constantly exploring in the child system, sibling system, what they can do, what works, what doesn't, what is going to be approved by the parents or the world, what is not. That's how they develop their own self-regulation, their internal moral capabilities. And the parents are supposed to kind of keep a hand in that so that it doesn't get out of whack. Right? It's less clear these days, I think, for parents. What is the appropriate role for parents? Because you hear all the time about parents who aren't acting very parental. Or the parental system may be disrupted because the spouse subsystem is broken. One of the parents may leave. Another person may come in. They may not be viewed as a legitimate part of the parental system. So that causes all sorts of troubles. Or they may try to intervene by themselves in the children's regulation, discipline, which causes then the other partner to become agitated. So there's all sorts of ways that this can kind of get out of whack. And that's, if you understand kind of what it might ought to look like, then you can have an idea where your intervention might want to go. So they talk about the boundary being kind of normal, where everybody kind of knows that, this is what kids do and this is what parents do and never the twain shall meet. Or it can be, very rigid, where the kid may come and have some legitimate concern, but the parents are just like, no, I don't want to hear about it, don't care what you say. It's a very rigid boundary that doesn't allow any kind of flexibility or modification. And here's where a lot more trouble comes in, I think, these days, when it's not clear who's the parent and who's the kid. Some of the other ways that this can get messed up, I mean, the siblings are supposed to kind of be equal. The parents sometimes have trouble treating their kids the same, so they pick favorites, which basically sometimes, causes a lot of trouble, not only with the siblings, but also with the parent-child relationships. Often you hear people talk about parental children, which is when one of the parents or both the parents are inadequate to care for the family, and so a child steps up and maybe takes care of the younger kids, makes sure they have dinner, gets them to school on time. Kids are remarkably able to do those things. I mean, you'd be surprised what a kid can do when they're forced to be responsible early. They don't ever feel good about that, though. They always feel like they're faking it. And then somebody's going to come up one day and say, hey, you're doing really good taking care of all your siblings, but you're just a kid and you're messing up. They don't seem like, to me, they don't ever get over that feeling of being a pretender. Because they haven't really been promoted yet, right? They got bumped ahead of the line. Does this make sense? Good old Bowen. His ideas are more diffuse. It's hard to pin his ideas down. I watched a video of him. Anybody seen him give a lecture? I mean, he's dead, but I mean, anybody hear him now? He was the most boring speaker I have ever seen in my life. And I've been to college. I went to college 9 years. I've seen boring speakers. Let me tell you. He was really into these triangle things. He would tell you everything 3 times. I mean, he would say, the family can get into trouble with triangles. The family can get into trouble with triangles. The family can, he repeated everything, and he was deadpan. I mean, probably a smart guy, but I don't know what it would like to be one of his patients anyway. You can see this when kids or parents or coworkers get into a conflict or some stress in the system, they'll often try to diffuse that by bringing somebody else in. And that doesn't work usually. These triangular relationships are often unstable, but sometimes because they are set up in order to manage disagreements or instability that was already there. One of the things that happens too in these sorts of, and I see this a lot working with, anybody work with couples? Anybody work with couples? No? You're kidding. Huh? It's really interesting to see what couples do with outside stressors. Many times what they do is, let's say they're both working and one of them gets their hours cut, okay? So there's going to be shortage of money. And that's not something that even one of them did, these days. That happens arbitrarily. One of the things they commonly do is they bring that problem into the couple and bounce it around. They start saying, well, if you hadn't bugged me so much, you called me at work so much, I wouldn't be being cut. Well, you're just lazy. That's why they cut your hours. Okay? So it's kind of a variation of a triangulation. They bring some external problem in and act as though if they squabble over it and fight over it, it's going to be solved. Y'all see that? Ever happen to y'all? It happens all the time. And if you don't understand the family as a system or the couple as a system, you'll get lost in that because it's kind of an appealing notion. If they argue good enough, he'll get more money. I don't think that works that way. Okay. So what you have to intervene in that, you say, look, wait a minute, this is not something that you two did. He didn't do it, you didn't do it, they did it. And one of the ways of managing conflict in a system is to recognize when it's not something that happened on account of the participants of the system, but happened external to the system. So sometimes, people will triangle somebody else outside the family into a difficulty. If the couple is disagreeing, one of them may call one of their parents and start, bad-mouthing their spouse. Y'all never see that, do you? that almost never works. So watch out for people trying to solve their own difficulties by bringing in another person. The other thing that you see is, and this is Bowen's concept of one of the tasks of a child during their development is to become more individuated. You start out completely dependent on your mother. Actually, you live inside her body. And then at birth, you become more independent. And as you acquire skills in living, you become more and more independent of other people. And yet, that is problematic for the family system sometimes, because if a person in the family becomes too different, they're not familiar anymore. The word familiar has to do with feeling like part of the family. And yet, we are encouraged in our society to become more independent and to live our own lives and to move away when we turn 18, etc. That's not true in all cultures, by the way. Even cultures that are in this country, but certainly my wife is from Latin America. People live at home until they marry. I mean, they may be 25 or 30, they still live at home. It's not weird. They don't want to go away to school. They want to stay in school and live at home. Here, if you're not out of the house by 18, you're kicked out sometimes, right? But there are families, especially close families, and close families are okay, but in which the individuation of a person in the family is just discouraged. And that sets up a conflict between them and the family, internally with the person as they try to become more independent and their own person. And Bowen thought this was a big deal. Now, some of this had to do with his theory that families cause schizophrenia. Because he thought that was the schizophrenic mother and all those concepts that were floating around back in the 50s. Double bind theory of schizophrenia, y'all remember that one? They don't teach that anymore, do they? Good, because it's not true. But this whole concept of disordered communication and disordered relationships in families causing serious psychopathology was kind of a new area of exploration. So he felt like this was a real important concept. When I first started working clinically in this area back in, I worked as 1978. Y'all remember that, right? I saw an undifferentiated family. Okay. The daughter was psychotic. She liked this particular TV show, Starsky and Hutch. Y'all remember Starsky and Hutch? Nobody remembers Starsky and Hutch, but I liked Starsky and Hutch. Had a cool car. She liked one of those guys. I can't remember whether she liked Starsky or Hutch. Whenever he would come on the TV, she would go up and kiss the TV. Okay. And she and her mother looked just alike. This girl was like 16 or something, and her mother and she would look just alike. And her father and the son looked just alike. And I thought, this is exactly what Bowen was talking about. I don't think they ever differentiated. I don't know what happened to it. So, questions. This was a kind of a short, you got things you think are important that I didn't bring up since you all were trained in this too? Say again?
It was excellent.
Well, I'm going to draw you a family and explain to you how you kind of discover these things as you were talking to someone about a family. Okay, kind of a case study. The trouble is that I thought, whose family am I going to use? Okay. I was going to use Sherry's, but then I can't pronounce anybody's name. Then I thought, well, can I use a patient? I thought, well, that's probably not quite ethical, right? So I guess I'm going to have to use my own. Please, if you see any great interpretive comments, save them for later. Okay. I'm going to kind of start low because I'm going to go back. I'm not going to go, into my children's lives. Is that okay? That's bad too, right? You don't want to talk about your kids in analytic terms in front of strangers, right? Well, if you want to hear about it later, just come up. I got stories. So once upon a time, this fella married this lady, and they had a kid. Okay? This would be me. Okay? Now, they had interesting families, and that's why I'm going to use them as a... And I'm kind of going to walk you through it as I discovered about the family. Because kids don't know, okay? They're not, you don't sit them down at age 5. Okay, here's the family. They learn it through osmosis. They learn it through emotions. They learn it through happenstance. And the first thing that made me think about families in a more complicated way was one day when I was 8 years old, okay, they were doing a census like they do every 10 years, right? And I was sitting there with my father filling out the census, and he marked, the question was something about, have you been married more than once? And he marked yes. And I said, you made a mistake. He said, no, I didn't. Don't tell the neighbors. Okay. I didn't ask him much about it, okay? But yes, he had been married before, okay? And they were divorced, okay? And I don't think I knew anything about this woman, and I still don't know very much about this woman. But later on, I started figuring out stuff about family. This was not his idea to get a divorce. He was not a happy guy about that. Turns out he was not a happy guy, period, okay? But he was not happy about that. So this was the first inkling in my discovery of family that there was something that I didn't know, okay? Now, he had a kind of a difficult life. His father died when he was 6. Okay, that was before I was born, by the way. Is that the correct symbol for dead? Okay. And so his mother, who of course was my grandmother, raised him for a while, and then she got remarried, okay, to this guy that I called Gramps, who was my paternal grandfather, okay. And I called her Mamie. I don't know why she wanted to be called Mamie. I guess it was Mamie Eisenhower, but I don't think she was a figure of admiration. But for my grandmother, she was. These people lived further away than where we lived than my mother's family, okay. So I saw him most often, all right? And then he died when I was 7. So I vaguely remember him, okay. He had been married before, okay, and he had 2 kids. Okay. And this was my aunt and uncle, my step-aunt and uncle, right? Okay. But like I say, we didn't see them very much, right? And when we did, it was kind of weird. Like one time, my grandmother was a school teacher, okay? And when she came to visit, she would quiz me. I guess that's how you interact with children if you are a school teacher. And one day, she came to visit. She didn't come very often, maybe once a year, maybe once every couple of years. We would go over there maybe once every 3 or 4 years. It was a long way back in the day. And so one day she said there, she said, name the Beatitudes. Recite the Beatitudes. And I go, I don't know what the Beatitudes are. That was not the right answer. I now know what the Beatitudes are, but I cannot recite them. Who can recite the Beatitudes? Blessed are the Greeks. No, wait a minute. That's blessed are the cheesemakers. No, wait a minute. This is from Monty Python. I'm sorry. Why did he say cheesemakers? I think he meant all manufacturers of dairy products. Y'all seen that movie before? So that kind of turned me off to Beatitudes. I didn't like feeling stupid, okay? Because I was an only child, right? So everybody said, oh, you must have been spoiled. Well, I didn't have a pony by God, okay? If you have a pony, you're spoiled, all right? I did not have a pony. Now, my mother's family is a whole other story, and I'll get into that in a minute. But then something else happened. My father died when I was 12, so that was better than his father dying when he was 6. Okay, but it was not good. Okay, so my mother, who we'll get to this in a minute. My mother, who was a stay-at-home mother, had never learned to drive. Okay. Now, this is interesting. I'm not so weird back in the day, but she didn't know how to drive. The other thing about my mother and father was that when they married, she was probably, I don't know, 38, 39, and he was 6 years older. So they were older, okay? And, so I was an only child. I grew up with a 5-kid family across the street, 6-kid family next door to them. I was weird, okay? And I went with the 5 kids. That made 6, and we got with the other 6 and said each other had cooties. We weren't sure what cooties were, but we knew we weren't supposed to have them. So that's good. So I had a lot of kids around. I felt I had a nice childhood. I had a good time. But she was older, and he was even older. So he didn't get out and run around like the 25-year-old fathers who lived across the street. And he wasn't particularly active. You wanted to do something, you had to bug him a long time, okay, which made me sympathetic to these children trying to get their parents to do things. But my mother didn't drive, and my mother, I don't think, knew how to write a check. And he died suddenly. He was in the hospital less than a week. And she kind of got flustered, all right? And we were living in Atlanta, and these people, of course, he'd already died. I don't know what happened to her. She might have died. I don't know. Never heard about her. These people lived in West Tennessee. At this point, he had died. I was 7 when he died. I was 12. So they were far away. My mother was not close to them. Probably she didn't know the Beatitudes either, maybe. That was probably it. So we ended up moving, okay? We moved to Chattanooga, where her family lived. So I'm going to start over again. This is after he died. So we moved to Chattanooga. I didn't want to do that. Apparently my parents and I lived in Chattanooga for a few months when I was an infant. I was born in Memphis. We left shortly after that. I think that was the best decision of my parents' life. But I grew up kind of in Atlanta, okay? And it was an interesting time because we moved right about the time I turned 13. In the Atlanta schools at that time, they went from K to 7, 8 to 12. No middle school, no junior high, okay? So I was going to have to go to a new school, a big high school with lots of kids from other places. But my best friend and his family, the family of 5, were moving to a suburb. It was a time of great transition. So it wasn't that bad in that sense, because things are going to be upset and fruit basket turnover anyway. But we moved to Chattanooga, okay, which is where my mother's parents lived, okay? And let's draw them, okay? Now, my mother, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to do this, had a younger sister, okay, who also lived in Chattanooga. And I'm going to kind of go up this way, all right? This is a marriage. She was married to this guy named Jack, who was my uncle, and they had 3 children. 2 boys and a girl. That's kind of weird looking, but you get the idea. And at that point, she was married, my cousin, and had 2 kids, and later had another kid, another boy. And he was married and had 3 kids, and he was not married. And this was my cousin, Paul, and he was 5 years older than me. These were like, this brother was 10 years older than him. This sister was 12 years older than him. So he was kind of closer in age than any of my relatives. And so we were kind of close. But he always lived 100 miles away. So I thought, well, great, we're going to move to Chattanooga and hang out with my cousin Paul, who I kind of looked up to. Well, he's 18. If I'm 13, he's 18. Guess what? He goes to Knoxville. There's another story there. But here's the interesting thing about my mother and her family. And everybody was living in Chattanooga, or except for him. He was in Delaware. He worked for DuPont. He was the family hero, this guy. He had gone to this. Well, let me tell you about my aunt and uncle. My mother was 6 years older than her sister. Okay, her sister had run off with this guy when she was 16. They got married. I think he was like 18. I don't know if he finished high school or not. Okay, this did not go well. Okay, and I didn't know much about that. I mean, I didn't know that they'd run off when they were 16. But I knew that my mother didn't like him. Okay? So what are we going to draw? That sort of squiggly line, right? What color was that? Okay? And later on, I figured out my mother didn't like him. Okay? Her father. And later, I didn't figure all this out until I was like 40, okay? But that's typical, isn't it? You don't think about these things in analytic terms. You learn about these things emotionally. Right? I knew my mother didn't like her brother-in-law. And so one day she said, I'm going to go visit my sister, and I went to visit my sister, and Jack offered me a drink. And I was so surprised. And I said, why are we surprised that Jack offered you a drink? I thought he was a drunk. She said, no, he never drinks. Okay. I thought, why don't you like him? I thought you didn't like him because he was a drunk. I must have been 20, 25 at this point. 30, I don't know. Old enough to ask these impertinent questions. No, that's not why I don't like him. Oh, good, you don't like him. Why don't you like him? I like him. He has a boat. He goes fishing. It's fun, you know. I don't like him. Well, it turns out she didn't like him for two reasons. One is, the main reason is that when they got married, when she was 16, obviously he was 17, 18, he had a job, okay? They came and lived with them, okay? My mother was still not married. My mother didn't marry till she was late 30s. She had to give up her room and sleep on the sofa, okay? She was 22. She was, and it was like, she didn't like that. I mean, would you like that? You know, this no good guy marries your little sister and makes you sleep on the sofa? No, you wouldn't like that. And I think he had a hard time getting himself established. He ended up doing really well. He ran a big factory in Chattanooga with a limited education. He worked his way up from nothing. It was the Quaker Oats grist mill. He had a couple of fingers where they got caught in the machine. Those are little funny-looking things in your grits. Okay, that was not a singer. But he had done really well. Okay. The other reason she didn't like him is because he was mean to her, and she was the first grandchild. And since my mother was not married, she was very close to her sister's children. And the way he was mean to my cousin was that he did not think that girls should be educated. And she was very smart, and she wanted to go to college, and he did not support her in that. And he made her work her own way through college. And she did that for a couple of years, and then I think the pressure was too much, and she dropped out and married her husband, who my father didn't like, okay? But he was a really nice guy, and he tried to help me out after we moved to Chattanooga, but he wasn't very smart, okay? And his name was Dick, and my father would call him Rapid Richard, because he thought he was not too smart. Okay? And these are what families do, right? Okay? Does your family do this? No. Y'all have a nice family. So my mother didn't like him for a number of reasons. Okay, so where did I get the notion that he was a drunk? Well, my mother didn't like drunks. Okay? Why didn't she like drunks? I remember as a kid, my father would go to some work function and she'd say, "No, don't drink more than one whiskey," you know. And I don't think I ever saw my father drunk. You know, he would drink a beer every now and then, have a glass of bourbon every now and then, but I never saw him drunk. I never saw my mother drunk. I mean, I think she had a little beer every now and then or something, but I mean, you know, drinking was not a part of my growing up. But I knew she didn't like drunks. So who's the drunk? Where did she learn not to like drunks? My beloved grandfather, who was the nicest guy in the world to me. The story in the family is that he used to be a terrible drunk, and he would get drunk and chase them all out of the house with a bush knife, episodically. I don't think he drank every day. But even if he did, he wasn't home every day because he had a job that took him out of town 3 or 4 days a week. He was a postal worker on the train. When they would sort letters on the train, he went from Chattanooga to Cincinnati. And that's what he did. He knew every town in Kentucky. Okay. He had to sort the mail and drop it off. Okay. So she didn't like, my mother didn't like, oh no, I'm sorry, that's not there. That should have been here. Okay. My mother didn't like her father. Okay. But by the time I came along, he didn't drink. I never saw him take a drink in his life. You know, and the family story is, when my oldest cousin was a small child, she saw him drunk and said, "Granddaddy, don't drink anymore." And he quit. Okay. I think that's probably true. Spontaneous remission of alcoholism in older people is not uncommon. Okay. Drinking and chasing people around with bush knives is a young person's game. You get older, you don't do that. I haven't done that in 3 or 4 weeks. But she didn't like him, okay? And neither did she. Okay? I mean, I figured that out once we moved to Chattanooga, that my grandmother did not like my grandfather. And she was very passive-aggressive about it. Sometimes aggressive-aggressive, but mainly passive-aggressive. That he bought a new car. Granddad liked to drive. He liked cars. He liked to drive. Had a big old Buick when I was a kid. He bought an Oldsmobile. Okay? Not a fancy one. It had a radio. My grandmother made him take the radio out of his car. He'll get distracted and crash. He did tend to back up until things broke. Okay? But, I mean, you know, wouldn't let him have a radio in the car. All right? And my theory is, to get back to our original idea, is that this problem here got triangulated with my mother. Now, I don't doubt that she didn't like being chased out of the house either, okay, if that's true. I found out that my mother and her sister had different reactions to this when I was about 45, and they were talking about my grandfather getting drunk and crashing the car and then having to go get him out of the ditch before the cops got there. My aunt was just laughing. This was the funniest story she'd ever told. Let me tell you about Granddaddy. He used to get drunk and I had to go down and get him out of the car and be in trouble. My mother's going. They had very different relations with their father. And I think that my grandmother triangled her in, because she stayed at home till like 20 years almost after my aunt had left. Okay. Never married till she married my father. And still was very close with her mother. Unfortunately, she died fairly soon after we moved to Chattanooga, a year or two. And my other grandmother died about 6 months after that. And I was tired of people dying, let me tell you, okay? And that left this here and this here. But this, my aunt was always tied up with her kids, okay? This was a really fused family, you know? They would go visit each other. And that's kind of what they did, you know? And I realized that I needed to move away from Chattanooga because I didn't want to end up doing this, okay? I wanted to become more differentiated. This guy was a family hero, okay?
and I'm almost out of time, but I'll tell you why. He was treated very differently than his sister. They were 2 years apart. He won a Navy scholarship, ROTC scholarship, to go to college. First, she'd gone to college, but I think when he left, she quit. If you do the math. So you don't, I think my uncle said, yeah, I'll do whatever I can to help you get educated. And that meant whatever he was helping her, which was not very much, didn't happen anymore. So I figured out, by the way, that my mother didn't like Jack for other reasons than he was a drunk, but I got drunk and confabulized, okay? So he won a Navy scholarship. Where did he go with his Navy scholarship? You know, they send you to different schools with the ROTC. They pay your way to school, and then you have to be in the Navy for X number of years, and they pay your books, and they pay your stipend, and, you know, it's really a great deal. Where did he go? He went to Princeton, of all places, okay? Anybody got a relative who went to the Ivy League? Not me, but only him. Okay. He went to Princeton, and his roommate, I guess they assigned you a roommate, his roommate was literally a Rockefeller, like one of the Rockefellers, the guy that got killed by headhunters in New Guinea. You remember that? One of the Rockefeller kids? Yeah, that was his roommate. Well, when he got up to Princeton, he was this, you know, poor kid whose father didn't graduate from high school, had stubby fingers, and he didn't want to be that poor kid. And so he started living like a Rockefeller. I think he had a little buffalo. Okay. Now that I look at it. And the story is that, you know, they have fraternity equivalents. His father would one day let the electric bill lapse, this guy, so that he could pay his bar tab. My mother didn't like that either. Now, I'm almost out of time, but it took me a long time to figure this out. When I was studying family systems, I was on my internship at Baylor in Houston, and see, I can draw names of big schools too. And my grandfather died at that point, and I had to come home for his funeral. And just everybody came, right? And I'm sitting around going, oh wow, this is my family, okay? And I've, you know, been steeped in all this family therapy stuff. And my mother looks at me and says, you're looking at us like we're bugs pinned to a board. I swear she said that. And I said, you're right. And because you got to pin them to the board. If you don't draw the picture and understand where all these, and you don't, you know, if it's look at your family, you don't know all the stuff de novo. If it's a family you're working with, you have to kind of think, well, why don't they like each other? What's the deal? And what happened? And you got to ask, okay? And if you ask, people will tell you most of the time. If they know. If they don't, then maybe they'll go, well, I thought he was a drunk. And they'll start thinking about those sorts of things. Now, I got all sorts of stuff to tell you about my cousins, you know. I didn't get the weird cousin Danny, okay? Have y'all got a weird cousin Danny? Yeah, okay. Poor guy, he the best job he ever had in his life, Danny, he's still alive, was using a pitchfork to pick up the dead dogs off the highway. And my cousin got him that job. But then he killed himself. And this family, this is weird cousin Danny, by the way. This guy was the only one. My mother said he's the only decent one in the bunch. He died of some sort of weird endocrine disorder. And she is an interesting piece of work. She got married at age 16, okay? She's been married 6 or 7 times now, and she is now 55, okay? She might get a couple more in, you know, I don't know. But when she wanted to get married at 16, she went to her grandmother and said, I'm going to get married. I want to get married at 16. And my aunt said, don't you do that. That's a terrible thing. And she said, well, look at you. And at that point, they'd been married like 50 years or something, you know. So my aunt had no leg to stand on. She did get married at 16, and that didn't last very long. And then she married, you know how it goes. And she's got 2 kids, 3 kids, 2 kids. I can't remember. They're my second cousins, one's removed. But you know, I hope this isn't been too boring. No family is boring. When you get to looking at it, none of these people, I mean, you look, they're nice people. I like my family, okay? But they are not boring. The stories are not boring. Figuring it out was very interesting. It helped me understand more of who I am and why I picked up vibes that I didn't know what it meant, and why my relationships were colored by things that happened years before I was born. And it's extremely enlightening. So that's my talk. Thank you.
Comments, questions? Yeah, anybody want to meet weird cousin Danny? He's got a girlfriend. She's an alcoholic, by the way. Okay,